Her connections to Vermont are strong. She was the chief of the staff to the United States Senator Patriot from 1982 to 1994. McCulloch-Lovell spent 7 years in the Clinton administration from 1994 to 2001. She was the executive director of the President's Committee on the Arts and Humanities and deputy chief of staff to Hillary Clinton. She was also deputy assistant to the president and advisor to the First Lady on the Millennium Project. McCulloch-Lovell, a strong proponent of civil engagement, acts as a member of several organizations, such as the National Science Foundation's Bioadvisory Council, a regent of the American Architectural Foundation, and an advisory council member for the Center of Folklife and Cultural Heritage at the Smithsonian Institution. So please give a round of applause for Ellen McCulloch-Lovell.
Well, Ellen, thanks very much for being here tonight. It's really great to have you on our campus. My name is Matt Gander. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a professor of journalism and writing here, and I'm going to be asking some questions of President McCulloch-Lovell that were generated by students in our political science, history, and journalism classes. And I'm going to alternate between asking some questions that were generated there that I have and calling on questions from the audience, and so we'll move back and forth between the two. And I thought I'd start with a question, having been in the Clinton administration and you've been through some elections pretty close to the ground, what's it like right now for President Obama and Michelle Obama and their kids, or for Obama and his family as they, at the end of this ruling campaign, as they wait for the decision?
Well, Mac, in the presidential debates, we always heard the candidates not answering the question right off the bat. So I just want to say I'm really glad to be at Landmark College. You're just up the road, and I think Landmark and Marlboro ought to be back and forth a whole lot, and we have a lot in common. And also, please call me Ellen. Everybody does at Marlboro, so you should too. Election night, I think I go into kind of automatic set of nerves the night before, and this week, and especially tonight, I've just had this sense of butterflies, anticipation, nervousness because the election is so close. And you should all know, full disclosure, I'm an ardent Democrat. I've worked for Democrats my whole life. But since I've been in an academic setting for the last 8.5 years, I've had more luxury than I did in my political life to think about ideas and the play and the interplay and the debate of ideas. So I hope we can get some of that going tonight. I do remember I've worked on a number of presidential campaigns, numerous Senate campaigns, innumerable governors' campaigns. And probably my most vivid memories are from the re-election campaigns of Senator Leahy when I was his chief of staff. And about this time is when candidates are starting to kind of separate themselves. The aides stay away respectfully and let the family gather around. I know Senator Leahy wouldn't even watch television on election night. He would be having dinner with his family. And the campaign manager and I would be watching, CBS or flipping channels, listening for the results. And fortunately, I worked on 2 senatorial campaigns in Vermont where it was pretty clear who was going to win, and so there was an early announcement, and I had the joy of walking into the family dinner and saying, CBS just called it for you. And on one election night, happened a little bit later, and I was able to go up and say, congratulations, Mr. Chairman, because in 1986, the Senate went from Republican to Democratic, and the senator became the chairman of the House Agriculture Committee. But it is a time, I think, of sheer nerves and exhaustion. These candidates were in, 5 states today? I mean, they're flying all over the place. They're just trying not to make a mistake. They're trying not to say something when the mic's on and you think it's off. They don't want any last-minute surprises. They just want to stick to their talking points, and they want to convey confidence. So you hear Romney and all the disciplined aides and friends reading the talking points, talking about how we have the momentum. And you have Obama saying, forward, forward. You know, look what we inherited, look where we're headed, think about how things are improving. Don't go back to the old policies of the past. So they're pretty much being very, very disciplined right now, and then they'll vote. And the one other thing that will probably happen tomorrow is that they'll start to get some exit polling. And that'll give them, especially as they watch key states like Ohio, Virginia, North Carolina, New Hampshire, that'll start to give them an indication of the outcome.
This has been very much an election that's about the economy. And when you were working with Hillary Clinton, the economy was very strong during the 1996 election, for example. Romney and Obama have very strong opposing kind of perspectives on what needs to happen economically. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how the economy is a factor in the current campaign and maybe reflect on where we've come since the 1990s.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to go back to the Clinton years because you probably remember the famous campaign slogan, "It's the economy, stupid." And then once Clinton was in office, his slogan was putting people first. And I think it's really just worth reminding ourselves, those years were the longest uninterrupted expansion of the economy in American history. 4% growth a year, growth and elimination of deficits from 1998 to 2001. 2001 being the largest surplus that had ever happened in the U.S. government. Unemployment dropped from 6.9% to 4% during the Clinton years. And something like 22.5 million jobs added, which no president can say, I created those jobs. You know, you can stimulate, you can exhort, you can increase people's confidence, you can help them invest, but outside the federal government, you're not really creating jobs. You're creating policies and incentives that create jobs and trying to include people in your program to create jobs. But that's a pretty amazing record. So we end the Clinton years with a surplus. And then we go into the policies that create tax cuts, increased military spending, spending on wars, and we start going in the other direction. And so I think that it's very stark, and that's one of the starkest parts of this election. So you have a Democratic president who believes in free enterprise and the capitalist system, but believes that there ought to be constraints on the free market. That there do need, the part of what government does is restrain and regulate appropriately. And that the tax burden ought to be more equal. And that health care ought to be a basic right, and everybody should be able to access it. And then I think on Romney's side, he professes that the tax cuts for the rich are a stimulus to the economy, that these are the people who are the job creators and the wealth creators, and that there should be less constraint on the free market. So that's a pretty stark choice, depending on how you see the society, what will stimulate economic growth, and how you define what is the public good.
Thanks. One more Clinton question, then I'll open it up to the audience. It was a pretty hard-fought campaign between Hillary and Barack Obama 4 years ago, and I think while the Clintons campaign for Obama the last time around, it seemed to be without that much enthusiasm.
For sure.
I was in Concord yesterday morning for the big rally of both Clinton and Barack Obama, and I was really struck by how incredibly dedicated President Clinton is to supporting Barack Obama this time around. And he said, I like Obama a lot more now, 4 years later, than I did then. And he said, it's because he's done the job. And I know how hard the job is and how hard it is to do right. But what shifted, do you think, for President Clinton and his, because he's brought amazing energy to this campaign.
Yeah, he sure has. Yeah. I think what's shifted is that he is a realist who sees what's at stake. And he's not going to let the history, say in the South Carolina primary from 4 years ago or more, hold him back when he feels that and thinks that the country would go in the wrong direction under Mitt Romney. And the other thing is, he's a political animal. He is the smartest politician I've ever known. And I think he just can't help himself. I think he's just got to get out there. He loves the crowds. He loves the stump. He loves how smart he is. He knows more than anybody, and he can answer those questions. And he's got this incredible gift of putting the most complex issues into common language that we can all understand, and the crowds respond to him. And I just want to say, again, as a partisan, I'm so delighted because it was really tough at the end of the administration. I mean, I think stepping back, you can see that a lot of good things happened, especially in the economy. But it was a rough second term in a lot of respects, and a lot of us were really disappointed in our leader. And I remember saying to John Podesta, who was chief of staff the last 3 years, and a very dear friend of mine, and just saying, looking at him and saying, history is going to be very kind to Bill Clinton. And I think Bill Clinton is helping history by being out there and being ardent and fighting for what he believes in, not only for a particular president. One other thing, the presidents of the United States are a very small club, and nobody understands you like a former president. That's why Bill Clinton and George Herbert Walker Bush have become so close, and you'd never would have imagined that. I mean, here's this young upstart governor from Arkansas who defeats this patrician, worldly, government-wise president, and yet they've become really close, and that's because they understand the stresses and the strains of the job. And I know we're going to probably talk a little bit more about that later.
Well, let me ask for a couple questions from the audience, and I'll ask you to keep them succinct if you can and to the point. Who would like to pose a question? Pete.
President Clinton had a booming economy when he was in office, but he repealed Glass-Steagall, which ultimately backfired, allowing banks to play with house money. Why do you think he did that?
I think it's fair to say, why did President Clinton fight back some of the constraints and regulations on the banks? Some people would make the case that it was that dereg that kind of set the scene for the crash that we had in 2008. And honestly, I don't know what I think. I think maybe the whole administration and the Secretary of the Treasury had convinced themselves that they were just going to keep this economic boom and ride going, and that this was going to somehow unleash some more innovation that would continue to build the economy. And instead, what we got was the creation of investments that weren't worth anything, and instruments in the stock market that weren't real products. And I think we reaped the results of some of that in 2008.
Being that you worked with the First Lady so closely, how big of a role does the First Lady now play, just in general, on the outcome of the election? I mean, I was just watching Michelle Obama's speech that she was doing in Orlando, and it wasn't really, her speech was not, I don't know, it was very political. And I don't think I wasn't used to seeing a First Lady being so political. But how big of a role do they play, and has it changed since Hillary was First Lady, or just comments on that?
Well, I think that Hillary changed the role of First Lady in a very, very significant way. You might even remember that for a while she had insisted on having an office in the West Wing, which is the guys' side of the house, the policy. That's where all the tough things happen. And the East Wing is the social side of the house. Although I'd argue that the social side of the house had a very important political and policy role as well. And, she's a really, really smart, highly educated, very engaged person who wasn't, as she famously said in the campaign, going to stay home and bake cookies. And Michelle Obama is the same way. So here, again, you've got a highly trained lawyer, somebody who's been in the world, and I think really appeals to some women and to African American women speaking her mind. As to how influential it is, people don't vote for First Ladies. But I think that First Ladies might make some people more inclined to listen to the president, to give the president a second look. And in the case of Mitt Romney, I think Ann Romney humanizes him. And so she's probably been a real plus for that ticket.
Mike's question makes me think of a more general question, which is really since the 1990s or maybe the 1988 election, the role of women in the electorate has become increasingly important.
Yeah.
And certainly it is right now. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how it's evolved and maybe where you see it heading in the future.
Some people will say that this election really is going to depend on women turning out and revolve around women. In the 2004 election, 8.8 million more women voted than men. And in the 2008 election, 9 million more women voted than men. Right now, the latest Pew poll says that 54% of women trust President Obama more with issues that concern them than Mitt Romney. But his lead is among single women and women of color. So there's that whole soccer mom phenomenon, suburban women with children, maybe not totally in the economy. Some are, some aren't. And I think the big question right now is, what matters to women? Is it the economy? Is it feeling like they're not struggling anymore and that they're confident of jobs and their kids having jobs? And then how do they decide, whether they think Romney's policies are going to enhance the economy or they're going to stick with Obama and see things continue to improve slowly as they have been in this Great Recession? Or is it what might be defined as women's issues? The ability to control one's body, access to birth control as part of health care, worries about the Supreme Court. If Ruth Bader Ginsburg is the next to resign, and I think everybody knows she's battled several really serious illnesses and she's in her 80s. If she resigns, then who replaces her? And in that is the balance of Roe v. Wade that keeps abortion legal. So, how are people thinking about the social issues and the economic issues? And I'm not sure, I haven't gone that micro into those numbers, but because significantly more women vote, their votes are going to really count.
Well, the exit polling will be interesting to
Yeah.
on that
Yeah.
score. So more questions, yes?
And what do you think the chances are that Hillary will run for president in 2016?
Well, a month ago or so, I would have said no. And not that I know, I'm not talking to her about it, but I think, you know, she's been on the world stage. My friends who work for her say, you know, she's exhausted. She's flying, you know, she's doing these very, very high stakes negotiations all over the world. And she's very, very interested in building civil society in former dictatorships. She started and maintained an organization called Vital Voices that is devoted to women's role in building democracies where there weren't any. And I think I was hearing that was going to be her, she was going to really devote herself to that work. Recently, I've begun to wonder whether there isn't a, you know, prototype campaign starting to form around 2016. So I think we'll just have to watch it. For myself, I would love to see her run, just as we wanted to see our first black president in our lifetimes. I want to see the first woman president in my lifetime.
Another question from the audience.
What do you have to say to people who think that, would say that voting doesn't matter or who the president is doesn't matter?
Let me repeat
Considering
that. The question is, what would Ellen say to people who think that voting doesn't matter or that the president doesn't matter?
Well, I feel so strongly about that. I'll try not to, as the farmer said, give you my whole load of hay. I've heard that a lot, and I've heard it recently. I've heard it from Marlboro students who said things like, well, you know, Occupy didn't work. The parties are just the same, and if I vote, I'm participating in the system, and the system's broken. And I don't want to be part of the system. And to me, that's dropping out of American society and your role as a citizen. If you're born in this country, if you come to this country and you're a citizen, you not only have a right, but you have a responsibility to make it better. And our vote is our strongest tool. Our activism is too. Our voices are, our opinions. But to not vote is letting everybody else decide for you, because then you're living under the system that they voted for. And for those who think that there are no real differences between Republicans and Democrats, take a look at this election, and you'll see some very, very stark differences, as you did between Al Gore and George Bush. There is a strain, and I have to say I've really experienced it in Vermont a lot. And I describe it as I'd rather be pure than compromise my values on somebody I don't agree with entirely. So you can be kind of self-satisfied and pure in saying, I'm not part of the system and nobody really fits my ideas and my standards. But once again, you're giving up your franchise that, you know, this country fought so hard to establish for men, for women, for formerly enslaved, for everybody. And, you know, are we really going to give that up in the 21st century? Are we going to say, well, nobody really satisfies me, so I'm going to sit it out? And then I think if you don't vote, in a way you don't have a right to criticize what does happen, because you weren't there and you didn't make it happen.
A follow-up question to that. No secret that there's a lot of dissatisfaction with the electoral process and the governance process.
Yeah.
And particularly, I think two things get noted a great deal. One is that the two-party system has become so polarized that we've got absolute gridlock in Congress, and that we need a middle ground, a third party, sort of Michael Bloomberg idea of a third way. And then the second criticism is that given the nature of our the electoral college, there are only 10 states or 9 states or 7 states right now that actually matter, where voting really counts. And I wonder whether you have thoughts about political reforms, or is this just the system we've got to sort of go with it and tweak it?
Well, first, Mac, I don't think it's the two-party system that's got us in gridlock in Washington. I think it's the Tea Party system and the orthodoxy of some people and their inability to compromise, which is part of the political process, and that's another answer to your really good question. We do have to compromise to meet each other in the middle, in some kind of middle ground at some points. And so this inability to compromise, this taking a stand to feed back to your home base, back home, speaking to the empty chamber on C-SPAN phenomenon, I think is part of how we got into this gridlock. And it happens on the left as well. So there are people who won't compromise and who are just talking to their small base on the left. So I think in a way we've gotten into a multi-party system, but we're still calling it Republicans and Democrats. That being said, I've always felt that the party system worked and that functioned to educate people and to support them to vote. But more recently, I've really begun to question my own stance and think that there is room for a strong third-party movement. I think that something needs to rise up to challenge the center, whether it's the center of the Democratic Party or the center of the Republican Party. I want to say that differently, not to challenge it, to move the center, to establish a new kind of center and a new possibility for compromise and consensus. And I do think we need more ideas in our system. And so when I see them coming from different places, like the Libertarian Party or other people, the Green Party, I think that we should welcome those and feel challenged by them and help to answer them. I think they do move our parties along. Somebody want to challenge that?
Yeah, I have a question. Most states, the way they're rigged up, third party is almost impossible to get started anyway. How can that be accomplished?
Well, I think that if you have a certain number of voters on a petition, you can get on the ballot. But you do have to reach a certain kind of threshold in a number of states. And that's pretty much all I know about it. Does anybody else know how third parties get on ballots in other states? In Vermont, it's fairly easy. And if you look at the ballot tomorrow in Vermont, you're going to see parties you never heard of.
I think that the challenge is that unless you reach a certain threshold in the popular vote, you have to repetition every time, so you don't actually become structurally part of the. And that's been the aspiration of the Libertarians or the Greens, is to kind of reach that 5% threshold, so that they're automatically on the ballot.
Yep.
That's a good question. Yes, way back there, Lisa.
Sorry, you keep using the word compromise.
Yes.
But I've been I like when people use the word cooperate instead. Since when you compromise, there's always this lingering feeling that you're going to have to concede something, whereas if you're cooperating, then you're helping each other towards each other's goals. So do you think that there needs to be an ideological shift within the ways that politicians think about compromise or cooperation, and they shouldn't think about having to give up something but working together for a similar goal?
Well, I like the way you made those distinctions, Lisa. And it is also true that when you take people from differing stances and they agree on something, they're both giving up something, right? There may be a few issues where it's not polarized and they're not you're not giving up a whole lot. But usually what it means, if you see a lot of Republican and Democratic co-sponsors on a bill, that somebody has given something up. But they've given it up because there's some core there that they believe in together and that helps each one of them towards their goals. So I guess I'm saying it's not either or, those aren't mutually exclusive. So even under your paradigm of let's think about cooperation and what will help each of us, you're still not able to cling to maybe everything that you want in a bill or a policy.
The question that I got from one of our students kind of follows up on that. Do you think that politicians, just by the very nature of politics, have to sometimes compromise their principles or not support things that they believe in order to get elected? And is that something that you might see happening in the current campaign of both Obama and Romney?
I'd love to know what this audience thinks about that. I guess I'll say something quick, but I really would genuinely love to know if you think these candidates have had to compromise on their ideals. But my reflection, Mac, is that I think most people I've known who run for office operate with a set of core values. You know, they have a kind of a compass, but they may not have formed positions on everything. And so there will be things that they really care about that are core to them, and there might be other things that are peripheral that they'll say, well, okay, I don't have a strongly held belief, or I don't have overwhelming evidence one way or the other, and I know that my voters really hate gun control, so, you know, that's okay. I'm for the Second Amendment. And I wouldn't call that necessarily giving up on your principles, because we can't have, I don't think we have principles about everything. We have ideas, we have strategies, we have goals. But principles, I would think, are, for me at least, those values that guide you as a human person, and if you betray them, then you've lost something that's really essential. And so, yeah, I think I see these candidates taking different positions, and I think one of them changes his positions a lot, according to debate and expediency. But I don't know that they're betraying their principles. What do you think?
Well, I think that given which side you're on, like whether Democrat or Republican, there's going to be a kind of like you could have your own ideals, but kind of there's like a boundary in which you could actually go like with a certain idea, how far you could actually take it, just so you can still have those votes. Because I think both sides do it because they're like, well, we need this vote and we need this many people, so you have to kind of, even if you might be not against it, but if you're kind of impartial, like you were saying, you'll lean more towards that side. Just
for expediency. Yeah. And sometimes it's really, really hard to make choices. Like, you know, a responsible legislator might vote to increase the debt ceiling because he or she wants to keep the government running. That doesn't mean that that person wants to run up trillions in debt. It means the person's practical enough to want to keep, you know, paychecks going to our military and the national parks open and scientific research happening.
I saw a couple other hands go up to that question. Becky.
Just when you asked, what do you think, it was right after you said something about the current election, and it made me think of, I mean, I agree with you. I think that a lot of times politicians probably, none of us have fully formed opinions about everything, you know? So it makes sense, and I think it's good that politicians will change their views sometimes to reflect their voters. but when a politician does something like state a really strong reason to be like to allow the choice for abortion for women in one election and then change that in another election, like that's ridiculous. You know, Romney's reason for changing his view or for being pro-choice when he was in an election against Kennedy was a personal reason about one of his friends who died after having an illegal abortion. And so, like, that's a personal principle right there. You can see that. You could see it in the way he talked about it and how he was passionate about it, despite the fact that he's personally pro-life. He wants everyone to have the choice so that people can stay alive, you know? And then when somebody changes an opinion like that, like, that's just compromising yourself personally. And that just, I don't know.
I think that's a good example.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, that's pretty core.
Yeah.
Although people do change their minds.
Yeah.
And I know pro-choice people who've changed their minds, and vice versa.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think you also said something really important, and that is that, you know, why is it that we want our politicians and our leaders to have a kind of core set of ideas and not change them? What about personal intellectual development? You know, when you get into an office and you confront all the problems and you see more of the evidence, I think we want them to grow and change their minds. I mean, it would be frightening if a president came in and never changed his or her mind about what was previously thought.
I mean, I also think that in order for the government to be for the people and by the people, that the views of the elected leaders have to reflect that of the people. So it makes sense for politicians to like change their views a little bit to reflect that of their constituency, you know, so that they can represent who they're supposed to be representing. But you also have to. It's hard to trust people that don't have moral integrity at the same time. So you have to find a balance there, I think.
Mm-hmm. This discussion reminds me of a tough question about Obama that one of the students posed, which is that, I mean, there was a sort of to and fro with Obama about whether or not he supported the Patriot Act and so on. And I think that more broadly than that, a lot of folks on the left perceive him as having turned out to be a much more hawkish president than maybe they thought they were electing, and perhaps also a president who was less supportive of broad civil liberties than they perhaps expected. His administration's really gone after whistleblowers, for example, in a way that really is almost unprecedented. And that does seem to reflect a shift in his thinking. I wonder if you have any comment on that or any thoughts about what might be going on there.
There was a moment in the primaries before the last presidential where Hillary Clinton was challenging Obama on his stance on the Patriot Act. And I went back and looked it up, which is why I pulled these notes out, because I couldn't remember it all. I just remember that there was a challenge. And it turned out that when he was Senator Obama, he voted to reauthorize the Patriot Act. But he also, the year before that, voted no on an arcane piece of Senate procedure called cloture. And cloture's when you close off a vote, basically. So he voted no, meaning he'd like to keep debating. But then he ended up voting for reauthorization. And then as president, he signed an extension of the Patriot Act, and then he ended up increasing some of its measures, and I have to check my notes on this. It was the National Defense Authorization Act. And so what you see is increased and tightened provisions for surveillance of citizens and for detention, not only of suspected terrorists who are not American citizens, but of American citizens. And I found this study by the ACLU that said that surveillance had increased something like tenfold under the Obama administration. And this is criminal wiretaps, not, this leaves out spies and terrorists. So we don't even have the data from Homeland Security. This is just Department of Justice. Sorry, fivefold. So, and Obama said, well, I didn't really like everything in the Defense Reauthorization Act, but I signed it because I wanted to keep the money flowing to the wars and basically to our personnel in uniform. And so I had to talk about compromise. I took all these other things, but I tell you, I promise you that we won't have, I will not authorize indefinite military detention without trial for U.S. citizens. And just to have to say that, to hear him promise that, frightens me. And yes, I do think that in our fear after September 11th, and yes, and the world is a really nasty place, and it is true that there are all kinds of things going down that we don't know about. So, there are people stopping terrorist acts on U.S. soil. But at the same time, talk about core values and ideals. How much are we going to give up to stay safe? And I think that's a really serious question we all have to ask. It's not something that I liked reminding myself of when I was thinking about the Patriot Act. I guess my own consolation is that I feel that my civil liberties will be more protected under Obama than a Republican administration. But I think we're going in the wrong direction as far as our civil liberties go.
More questions from the audience?
When Obama was campaigning for the first time in 2008, he talked about change in Washington, and I was wondering if you happen to know what change has taken place in Washington, or a good example of that. Because I think Obama's great, but I don't know what he was talking about, really, to be honest.
I do think that the ethics laws have gotten much tighter, and so there are tighter controls over, the relationships that people bring in to federal agencies in the White House, and then what you can do and where you can take that experience when you exit. I think that he really believed that by force of his personality and winning with a significant margin in 2008, that he was going to bring about a more of a bipartisan atmosphere. And I think instead what he got was a Republican House that felt that he wasn't even a legitimate president, and they were going to try to defeat him from before he took the oath of office. And so things are more polarized than ever.
Maybe shift gears here from you're president of the college, and education has been a topic that has come up somewhat during this election. Perhaps
not enough.
I was going to ask you that, actually, whether you thought it's been discussed enough and how you might contrast the two candidates' perspectives, maybe particularly on college education and affordability, but on education in general.
One thing I'm really concerned about is Pell Grants. Now, Marlboro, about 1/3 of Marlboro students are Pell eligible. And we think that having that kind of socioeconomic diversity is really, really important at a college. All kinds of diversity is important, including socioeconomic. And I know that Obama is really dedicated to continuing the steady increases in Pell Grants over the next 10 years. It's only up, the maximum is only up to $5,500 a year anyway. And that's a small percentage of a landmark tuition or a Marlboro tuition, but a really important part of it. for a lot of our young people. And Romney has talked about tightening eligibility, saving money by making fewer people eligible for Pell. And he also wants to eliminate the $10,000 tax credit for families who are sending a student to college. And Obama wants to continue that. So that's a kind of basic affordability difference between the two of them. Obama has, and the Senate and Tom Harkin have been pretty tough on the for-profit educators, colleges and universities. And I think that they should be, because they're soaking up a huge amount of our federal aid and their graduation rates are abysmal. And the default rate is higher than in our other not-for-profit and private colleges. So we should be really, really concerned about the role that they play in the marketplace. And I think Romney and Ryan, with their bias towards the private sector, and the private sector can do things better, like maybe we shouldn't have FEMA, maybe we should send the money to the states, or even better, he said, the private sector. It worries me about the stance they'll take towards the for-profits. But there are things that they've been agreeing on. They've been talking about the problem with debt, about the cost of college escalating beyond the consumer price index every year. And the Obama administration has been very dedicated to either regulating or scaring us all into controlling or even lowering our tuitions. And I have an argument with the Obama Department of Education right now. I think they're using too much regulation. They're costing us money that we would love to save in tuitions, the cost of tuition. And they think that online education is the answer to more Americans getting a college degree. And I really disagree with that.
A couple more questions from the audience. Yes.
Staying on education for the moment, what is your opinion about tenure? And do you have any feeling about the good aspects of tenure and the bad aspects of tenure?
At a small college like Marlboro, which doesn't pay a very, very talented faculty nearly enough for all the education they have and for how hard they work, I strongly support tenure, because tenure is this agreement between the faculty member and the institution that, they're making a commitment to the college and we're making a commitment back to that faculty member. And no one's going to get rich teaching at a small liberal arts college. But what we can do is say you have some job security and you have the freedom to develop and teach and do your research without anybody criticizing you. However, we also have a very good review system. So the faculty members are reviewed regularly up to tenure, and then they're reviewed every 5 years after tenure. And that's how they get a lot of feedback. So it's not like they're, it's a lifetime job and then nobody ever evaluates you. It doesn't work that way, I think, at a good college. I know people have criticized it and felt, especially with no mandatory retirement age, that some faculty stop growing and they become dead wood and there's no way to get them to move on, and you need to revitalize your faculty and you need more choices. But really, I think if the curriculum has to change, sometimes faculty can change with it, or there are other ways to do that than throwing out the whole tenure system. The other thing I'll say is that I think that only something like 37% of faculty members at colleges and universities in America now have that kind of agreement. Other courses are taught by adjuncts. And it's a scandal. It's an exploitative system where you have people who spent all those years in college getting their MFAs and their PhDs, and they're being paid $2,800 to $4,000 a course, and commuting from college to college to college to try to make a living. And that's not a good way to teach either.
I just wanted to say about how you said after the tenure they get evaluated every 5 years.
Right.
Why would you not just continue to evaluate each year? Because you're saying to see growth, you could also, I mean, yeah, it'll show it more drastically within 5 years if they were like slacking or if they were growing or whatever. But I think if you continue to, I guess, evaluate them, I think that would be more beneficial to the teacher and the students, because it'll just give the students more of a voice in saying that this teacher is good for these reasons, but they need to work on this, and it will so that laziness or whatever of the teacher doesn't start to happen. Mm-hmm. It'll just be like, okay, well, I know that I need to step this up, or I need to start doing this more, or whatever.
Well, just remember, and this must happen at Landmark too, every teacher is evaluated by every student who takes a course from that person. And so every semester, the teacher sits down with all of those class evaluations, and it's not just numbers. You know, it's not a Likert scale, 1 to 5, it's also comments. And so that person is getting a lot of feedback, and believe me, teachers at Marlboro take that really seriously. And I'm sure teachers at Landmark do too. So I didn't say that, but I think there's continual feedback.
Okay.
I'm going to ask that we turn the conversation back to the elections here, if that's all right.
Okay.
If that makes sense. And I'll ask for a question about the elections if we've got one. Otherwise, I'll ask one myself. Anybody have one? But one question I've got is...
Everybody feels like that little 4-year-old kid on YouTube. I'm tired. Tired of Bronco, Obama, and Mitt Romney.
Oh, yeah.
When does this end?
I want it to be over.
Well, I have just a couple more questions that students have generated. One of which has to do with an issue that I think is extremely important to younger folks today, but it's also been largely missing from the campaign, which is the question of climate change and carbon emissions, the effect on the climate, all of which was really highlighted for us in the last week or so with, with the monster storm Sandy. Why do you think it is that we haven't been talking about climate change in this election, and what do you think will happen depending on who's elected in the next 4 years?
I wish I knew. I mean, I'm kind of stunned by the absence of, in the face of growing evidence, the absence of a real clarion call to action. I think you hear it more subtly, for example, when Obama talks about alternative energy and wind power and all those new jobs. I think that the Democrats are afraid that it will it'll get turned into a charge that they don't care about the economy. I think we're kind of back to that old polarization where we shouldn't be in either environment or the economy. And what we need is a green economy. And I think he's started to talk about that, but not in a way that provides a lot of leadership on addressing the issue of climate change. And I think a lot of people feel incredible urgency about it, that if we reach that tipping point, there's no going back. So I think that's the fear, but I think within the administration there is more going on than is being talked about in the campaign.
So it's partly just a political strategy in terms of what's a winnable strategy right now as opposed to what you might do after the election?
Yes, I'm afraid so.
maybe one or two more questions from the audience, then I've got a couple to finish up with. Yes?
What do you think the impact will be if they end up having to have the election settled in the Supreme Court again?
Oh, boy, I hope that doesn't happen. I'm going to duck a little bit by saying that I think that we'll have a clear winner. And love or hate the Electoral College system versus the popular vote, I think it's looking like there will be a clear Electoral College winner. If it went back to the Supreme Court, let me play with that just a minute. I think if it went back to the Supreme Court, that they would be extremely reluctant to be charged with making that decision again. That there was a sense of in a sense almost tampering with history in not continuing to allow the vote count to go on in 2000. And so I think that would be a very unusual circumstance. And I think that the country could tolerate not knowing who's president a little bit longer to allow votes to continue to be counted and for challenges to happen. You know, I don't think that what happened back then needed to have happened. But, you know, we are where we are. But I think that they would be really, really reluctant to be seen as political as that court was, in my opinion.
You're heavily involved with students and with the younger generation. What do you feel is, or how optimistic are you about their capability to move the country forward? And maybe a two-part question. What do you think is their greatest strength, and what do they need to work on, or maybe focus more on for the coming days?
Well, voting would be my first thing. That, you know, the most important thing anybody can do right now, tomorrow, is make sure that you vote. But I think that we have a lot of strengths in our youth, and that the youth vote has been going up. I really hope we don't see a downward trend in this election, but that we continue to build on the upward trend from the last election. I have a sense that younger voters were more excited and animated about that election than this election. So I'm a little worried about that people will sit it out. But I think as far as, you know, the willingness to serve, to be involved, to think about the issues, to study, to make and to challenge arguments, that makes me really optimistic about younger voters. As far as what to do, Austin, I think the biggest thing is to fight cynicism. You know, to think that I don't matter, or the system's so broken I don't want to participate. And you know, what we need is that participation and that passion that you all bring to it.
I've got a couple of questions, maybe looping us back to the Clintons in those years as we sort of bring this to a conclusion. Maybe in a little more personal vein, you worked really closely with Hillary Clinton when you came into the White House, as you described, because of your connection with her. And of course, you must have known President Clinton as well. What were they like as people? A couple of students asked that question.
Well, I'm glad they asked, and I'm realizing sitting here tonight that some of you were probably, what, 7 or 8 when Clinton was in the White House. First of all, Hillary, somebody I admire so much for her strength and intelligence, but she is one of the funniest people I've ever known, and loves to laugh, loves to joke around, wonderful sense of humor. And so I was always surprised in the darkest days of the Clinton administration how much we laughed. But also extremely caring, and not in an abstract way. I think it's probably okay if I tell the story, but we were sitting at a senior staff meeting, and she brought up an article that she had seen on the front page of a major newspaper, and it was about a young woman who was being taunted at school because she didn't have trendy clothes. You know, she had the wrong brand of sneakers, and she didn't have the, you know, cool jacket. And the First Lady asked if we could find out, if we could identify her, because she wanted to do something for her. And she wasn't going to announce even among a tight group of 8 or 10 people what that was. But that story moved her so much that I know she did something about that. And she gave all of her honoraria from her books to the causes that she cared about related to children and to women. The president, what a charismatic, complicated character. I just remember being terrified when I had to do briefings with him, and I would prepare every possible way I could, and I would have fact-checked everything 3 times and try to imagine every question he might ask me. And, you know, I wasn't doing Kosovo or, you know, foreign policy or the heavy stuff. And we'd go into the briefing, and he'd be all business, and he'd have the speech in his hand, and he'd have his pen in his hand. And one time I went, we were standing there looking at the speech, and it was, you know, and he was usually running late, so we had like 2 minutes before we had to start the event. And he looked at me, and it had writing all over it, and he said, "Who wrote this?" And I remember my heart sank. I had not written it, but I was not going to say who wrote it. So I took a deep breath, and I said, "Okay, how do we fix it?" And we did. And then we walked in, and he did a fantastic job, and it made it sound like he'd memorized it, and he knew, you know, absolutely everything. It was totally spontaneous. Another manifestation of his incredible ability to absorb information and to put it across. I was in my office, and I got a call from the social secretary, and she needed somebody to come over and man a table at the White House prayer breakfast. And so I ran over to the East Room. Was it the State Dining Room? I guess it was the State Dining Room. And there were these tables of religious leaders, you know, from all religions. And I sat there and had a wonderful talk with the people I was there, and then the president came in, and he reached into his jacket and he pulled out these cards that his speech were on, speech cards. And I don't know if you've ever seen them, but they're about like this, and they have great big writing on them, so you can just kind of flip through them and talk and look at the audience. And he took out his speech cards, turned them upside down on the podium, and talked for 45 minutes about religious diversity in the United States, about religious freedom. I mean, people were speechless. It was so brilliant. You know, standing there with his arms hanging over the podium, just speaking from his heart and speaking from his knowledge. And that's how he got people to support him.
So one last question, an easy one for you. What do you think is going to happen tomorrow?
Well, I told you I'm a partisan, and I told you I'm very nervous. I'm going to call it for Obama, and I'm more confident of that tonight than I have been in a couple of weeks.
How do you think it's going to break? Do you have any kind of prediction with all the swing states?
I don't know that I can run down the states, but I think he gets Ohio, and I think that's critical. I think he gets Virginia. I don't know about New Hampshire, but I think those are pretty important. And I have a great deal of respect for Andy Kohut and the Pew Center for People in the Press for their survey research. And they're looking at something like 50-47, and I don't know what happens to the other 3%. I really don't. And it's not that, I think actually polls right now are really difficult. It may be that people are even lying to pollsters right now because they're so sick of being polled. But I think after a declining, I think I'm seeing a trend back. But as I said at the beginning, you know, the Romney people are really saying we have the momentum. Of course, you know, if they're seeing some softness and they're having doubts right now, they've got to say that because they've got to motivate their voters. And I will say, and I'm sorry it's the conventional wisdom, but it all comes down to get out the vote tomorrow. It all comes down to who votes. And I am worried about our fellow citizens in New York and New Jersey who have other things on their mind and may not be able to get to the polls. But so that's I don't usually like to make predictions, but what's yours?
Obama.
I don't know.
You don't know? Anybody think Romney got the big mo and is going to win? You do? Huh?
I'll say it for him. I do.
Okay. Anybody else?
No, I don't think so. Can I ask just one quick question? Do you think voter suppression is really an issue in this election?
Yes, I'm so glad that came up. Yes, I do. I read earlier this week that since 2011, 17 more states have enacted laws that make it more difficult to vote. And I think, don't hold me to this, but I think that brings the total up to 32 states. And I think it's aimed at poor people and people of color and people who have a hard time going through official processes to keep them away from the polls. And I'm really, really concerned about it. And I think there could be a number of challenges about the voting tomorrow because of that. Yeah.
I just want to know in what ways does it do that? Because I actually have never, I don't know how it impacts it.
Okay, so who wants to describe? Do you want to answer his question?
Oh, voter
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah. In what ways has it been suppressing?
well, let's say when there are long lines for people waiting to vote and they close the poll, they close the voting. It discourages people if they have to have voter ID and they don't have any ID. It disenfranchises them. If they're given misinformation about what they need to have to vote, people won't vote. So it seems like there's a lot of ways that's happening. And I wonder what we can do about it.
And also, some new citizens have gotten mail that scares them, that thinks that that somehow their citizenship is going to be challenged. And Charlie and I were talking earlier about the narrowing of the opportunities to vote and to vote on weekends and to vote early. So if you can't vote on a weekend, or it's a big rigmarole to get an absentee ballot and you're a working person and you can't afford to take that time off, that could be another form of voter suppression. Why don't we have a national holiday to vote? You know? And why do campaigns have to be 3 years long? It's just
Well, we're going to be starting the next one almost. Thank you very much, Ellen. It's really been a great pleasure.
It was really nice to be here. Such a friendly crowd. I think maybe we need more diversity of opinion in southern Vermont. Thanks very much for inviting me.